So this first one, hydrogen key concepts, we're going to go through, hopefully giving you a good introduction to the various terminology, that kind of stuff, some of the numbers, some of the kind of fundamentals, if you like, the framework within which we can build the rest of the sessions upon. So later on in other sessions, we'll be looking specifically at renewables, electrolysis, then we'll also be looking at the gas networks, we'll be looking at business models, some of the wind integration, that kind of stuff. Yeah, Nad gave me a brief intro. Again, details are on the screen there in front of you. I guess one thing to point out is I've not only worked with Nad for a long time, I work on not just on hydrogen, I started and still do looking across renewables. So I look at renewables and the various things that go along with it, with growing those. So that includes energy storage, it includes hydrogen, of course, and it also includes these days electric vehicles and grid integration of those things. I think it's important to point out, because I don't have any hydrogen products to sell you. I don't have any sort of gain to make from hydrogen having vast growth, because I look at all these areas. So hopefully what I'm going to give you is an independent viewpoint. It's going to be a viewpoint which is not kind of slavishly pro hydrogen and also not slavishly against hydrogen. You'll notice I look at battery storage as well. I find a lot of the debates around hydrogen tend to be quite polarized these days. You either seem to have to be completely in favor of it as opposed to everything else, or completely against it, with the various arguments that get trotted out over LinkedIn and so on. So anyway, I'm hopefully going to give you a perspective which sort of manages to tread the path between those things. I'll point out some of the numbers, some of the scale issues, but also we'll obviously look at some of the opportunities involved with growing hydrogen along the way. Okay, so we'll start off, again, just quite broadly, this idea of a hydrogen economy. The hydrogen economy, I think the term was first couched in about 1972 or something, and I forget the name of the person that couched it, but it's been around for a long time. It went away a little bit. In fact, it was around the first oil crisis, I think, back in the 70s. It kind of went away a bit. It seems to be making a bit of a comeback now, and I guess an obvious question as to why that would be. And I would suggest that the answer really is obviously around decarbonisation. And in particular, it's around the idea that we've been pretty successful. I say pretty successful in terms of electricity. Down here at the bottom, I'll just check if my pen's working. Yes, it is. This is global, so global decarbonisation. This is based on various figures from compiled from the International Energy Agency and also BP. About 65% of electricity is still fossil fuel, a big chunk of coal, a big chunk of gas, and very little these days in terms of oil. But if you add nuclear as zero carbon, at least at emissions point, like power plant emissions, and then you add up all the kind of solar, wind, hydro, geothermal and other things in the world, in terms of electricity, about just over a third now is low carbon, zero carbon, whatever terminology you want to use. But obviously with transport and with heat, we're looking at much lower numbers. And so one of the things around hydrogen, one of the rationale around hydrogen is very much, okay, well, what about the things that are proving harder to decarbonise? How do we decarbonise heat? How do we decarbonise transport? And of course, with transport, we can come back to that. That's where we get into things like the debates between hydrogen and battery, for example. And we'll mention briefly around how we then have to start segmenting these particular markets a bit further. But I would suggest that this really is the key driver, is how do we decarbonise things that have currently proved quite hard to decarbonise. So the other issue, of course, with hydrogen is that we already use it. We already use a lot of it, and it's all in industrial use, pretty much all in industrial use. We'll come back to what those industrial uses are a little bit later. But it has a very big carbon footprint. Again, one of the criticisms for hydrogen at the moment is that it's made from fossil fuels, and 90% of it is, high 90% is made from fossil fuels, largely natural gas, but in China also quite a bit of hydrogen from coal. And when you look at how much that, the emissions associated with that, because if we're splitting hydrogen from hydrocarbons, we don't just split out the hydro, we split out the carbon as well, which floats up into the atmosphere. And this is quite a well-known quote. It came from an International Energy Agency report that came out last year, pointing out that if you look at the carbon footprint for existing hydrogen usage, it's huge. And so one obvious thing, as well as what we talked about on the previous slide, about the energy side of things, transport, heat, electricity, is also how do we decarbonize just hydrogen production currently. There's no point producing lots more hydrogen if we're producing it in a dirty way. So even if we just didn't even make a dent in those previous segments, but just decarbonize hydrogen itself in its existing industrial usage, we'll make a big dent on the carbon footprint of the world.